interested in the topic and they'll look at it in their own time.
Well, I think this is the right week, right? The run up to Tisha B'Av is an interesting time to be thinking about death, mourning, and how to make meaning.
Yeah.
So that works. Okay. Now we all have to accept. So we'll give it another minute and then we will start on time-ish to respect those who actually came on time, which is really appreciated. And I'm excited to be having this conversation with both of you.
Me too. Nechama and I met up in Jerusalem recently and we chatted for, I don't know, an hour and a half and realized we could have gone on for another hour and a half.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's how it always works.
Yeah. We had the same in London then.
Exactly. So, all right. So I'm going to say welcome. I'm very excited to be opening this evening. I'm Naomi Marmon-Grummet, the founder and director of the Eden Center, for anybody who doesn't know. And I really am thrilled that everybody's joining us tonight, for all those who are watching live and for all those who've said that they're going to be watching afterward. This evening, for every Tahara, there is a time of life, a time of death. And we're going to be discussing the unlikely and unexpected parallels between the Tahara of Mikveh and the Tahara of the Chevra Kadisha. Our guests tonight, our panelists, are Sally Berkovic and Nechama Goldman-Barish, and I will introduce them formally in a minute, but I want to also take the first moment to just introduce whoever doesn't know to the work of the Eden Center. So in general, the Eden Center works to improve the experience of Mikveh and to use Mikveh as a platform to empower Jewish women and couples around their spiritual, physical, intimate, and emotional health. We do that by running community programs, creating resources, providing professional training around mikveh and well-being, from webinars like tonight, podcasts, to printed resources such as a breast cancer self-awareness poster that we created specifically for mikvaot, or our Birkat Emunah resource to support women and couples going through infertility or loss. We run a unique mikveh attendant training course with an emphasis on sensitivity, and we train women who have never been mikveh attendants, and we have programs for women who have been mikveh attendants for a long time. We train Chatan and Kala teachers, and we invite you to take part in those over Zoom. Our next round of courses are starting right after the Chagim. And we do much, much more. I invite you to explore what we do on our website, www.theedencenter.com. EDENCENTER, for the British among us who might spell it otherwise. And as always, I remind you that our work is only made possible through the generosity of donors. So please consider making a donation to the Eden Center so that we can continue to run programs like tonight at no cost. www.theedencenter.com/donate. Tonight's conversation really connects to our goal of allowing the discussion around mikveh to provide an opportunity for both spiritual consciousness and connection to our bodies, the life cycle, and of course, the concept of tahara, which is a central concept around mikveh. So with no further ado, let me introduce the speakers properly so that we can begin the conversation formally. Sally Berkovic grew up in Melbourne, Australia. She lived in New York and Jerusalem, and then she succumbed to the greatest temptation of all, love and marriage, which took her to London nearly 30 years ago. I don't know why that is like a trigger for me, but you know, in the week of Tisha B'Av, one of my thoughts is, what are we allowed to live outside of Israel for? That's one of the reasons. So may we see you here soon, living and prospering. But Sally worked as a social worker for many years. Since 2009, she's been the CEO of the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe. which is the foundation that supports Jewish heritage and culture across Europe. She's the author of 2 books, Under My Hat, which focuses on the impact of feminism on Orthodoxy. And recently, she wrote Death Duties, which is a book about her experiences as a member of London's Chevra Kadisha, and also a personal reflection on the impact of mourning, loss, and recovery. This book is available on in Yerushalayim. It's available at Pomerantz and Chavruta bookstores. And there we go. Well, I'll try to show it to you later also. And if you want to order it, you can do that via Sally's website, which is sallyberkovic.com. As her name is spelled on the screen, just make that one word and put .com at the end and you'll get to it. So thank you, Sally, for giving us a reason to come together today and to provide interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Nechama Goldman Barish is a yoetzet halacha, a sex educator, Kala teacher, a mikveh attendant, as well as a scholar of Talmud and halacha. She teaches in several locations in Jerusalem, including Matan, TVA, and the Pardes Institute. She's a frequent speaker at Limud and in the Eden Center's Kala teacher and Balenit training, and is also currently writing a book. We're waiting for it to come out. And we're waiting to hear the title, all in good time, but we'll keep you in suspense for now. So we're doing this evening in the week of Tisha B'Av, which is a week of mourning in Jewish life. We really experience this week, I think, particularly all different kinds of things that as a community we focus on as rites of mourning in general, particularly around the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. But those are things that the rites of mourning are highlighted for us as a community during this time. And you wouldn't necessarily think that there's a connection between the tahara of death, the tahara that we go through at death, and the tahara of taharat hamishpacha. But when we began discussing it, Sally, Nechama, and I, we actually found some very interesting connections, and that's what we're going to do here tonight, is explore them together. So Sally, why don't we start out with your sharing with us a little of what it means to work on the Chevra Kadisha, what the Chevra Kadisha does, what your role is there. I feel like a lot of people are not actually familiar with what a tahara is, so I'd love for you to give that introduction.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. When I was a few years ago at a significant birthday, I decided to give myself a gift. And that gift was to join the Chevra Kadisha. I really wanted to pay it forward for people, for unknown, anonymous people who did the Tahara for my parents. Just very briefly, and it's a detailed procedure, but to give people a sense of it. What happens during the Tahara process is the mace, the dead person, is in the room. It's very quiet. There are usually 4 men do men, women do women, 4 people usually, 1 woman on each side of the person and 1 woman at the head. And we wash the body with tap water, sort of the physical body, always covering the person's body with a sheet when, so we do an arm and a leg, the main part of the torso, each part separately and covering up modestly the rest of the person's body. Once we clean the fingernails, the toenails, we remove any vestiges of death from the hospital, if there's tubes, bandages, and everything is done very quietly, very considerately for the person lying there. Once the body is washed physically, we sort of wash it spiritually, in the sense that we use water from the same sort of water that is used in a mikveh. Nechama knows about the mikveh experience, and that water is washed, spread over the body. And then we dress the body in tachrichim, special shrouds, which have their own history for another topic, usually a pair of pants, a tunic. The men have a slightly different set of clothing, a bonnet, a face mask, and around the waist, we tie a knot and a special shin to represent Shaddai, Hashem's name. So we also tie the tachrichim, the shrouds, with a bow, but we don't complete the bow. It's sort of symbolically that the bow can be undone very quickly in in the event of needing to leave for Olam Haba. The body is then placed in a coffin, and I appreciate in Israel that is different, where a coffin isn't used, and there are many different minhagim in different places, but that's sort of the essence of it. And one very poignant note, and I'll wind up with this issue, is in the coffin we place two small pillows filled with sawdust that sit in the coffin, and the person's head is rested on that pillow. So I find a very poignant moment that even in death somebody should be comforted with the pillow on their head. A little bit of land from Eretz Israel is sprinkled on the body as well. So if the person can't be buried in Israel, at least a bit of Israel is brought to that person. The coffin is closed, and then the funeral takes place. So my role is really, as I say, just a foot soldier. I'm one of the people in the room. We're on a rota. I do Sundays if I'm working on other days, and we're called as necessary. There's usually a team leader who sort of guides us. There's a whole back office of, administrators, people who have to get the body, the shomrim, the people who go to the hospital, or to pick up the body if the body's in the hospital or at the home. That's all sort of happens before you get to the tahara room, and thankfully all those people are in place. So I'm really just do my bit, and it's been I'm going to say privilege. It's not quite the right word, but I feel like it's a valuable opportunity to be able to volunteer in some way in the community. So that's sort of very rough idea of what the Chevra does. I suspect there's a couple of people on the call who have had some involvement. We don't talk about it, which is one of the things, the sort of taboos, the secrecy around the Chevra that Nechama and I have chatted about, the parallel between that and the mikveh experience, which I'm sure we'll get to.
I want us to talk about that a little more. I actually obviously the Chevra Kadisha is about mourning, and before we continue with other parallels, I kind of wanted to bring, what's the mourning involved in mikveh? Because that's not obvious. Nechama, do you want to address that a little bit?
It's hard to say that there's mourning in mikveh. Although I will say one of the most powerful essays I read on Tuma and Tara, the ideas of impurity and purity, which connect death, which causes the body to be in a state of Tum'ah. For lack of a better translation, I'm going to use the standard impurity, although that's not really accurate. And menstruation.
Feel free to use Tuma and Tahara, because those translations. Tahara,
right? So just once I'll say Tuma is a kind of impurity, and the Tahara is a kind of purity that reflect both a physical and a spiritual state. And so death is one of the causes, but so is menstruation, and so is seminal emission. And in this essay that Rachel Adler wrote years ago, 1973, on Tuma and Tara, she really connected the loss of the potential life in menstruation. I'll just read an excerpt because I think it's quite powerful. She writes, Tuma is the result of our confrontation with the fact of our own mortality. It is the going down into darkness. Tahora is the result of our reaffirmation of our own immortality. It is the re-entry into light. And then she points out that menstruation really is a kind of dying when the lining is shed. It's an autumn within, the dying which makes room for new birth. And so I had never thought about that lens, that we essentially go to the mikvah to go through tahara, and then the body kind of goes through a reset, whether we want to become pregnant or not. There's a resetting of that hormonal process, which potentially can lead to conception. So I don't know if I like the word mourning. I'm going to talk in a minute. Some people find mikvah to be a mourning space, but that's very specific, and I'll talk about it. Here, I loved the idea of the cyclical nature of life and death is also mirrored even in the menstrual cycle of women, where there's not death per se, but there's the loss of the opportunity in the previous month to bring life into the world. And so I think that was very powerful. I remember reading that even before I got married and thinking that's an interesting connection between all the types of Tuma and Tara, the states of Tuma and Tara. As far as mourning, Nomi, obviously the mikveh can be very fraught for some people, meaning it's a process. It's a very very physical process. You bathe yourself and you undress and you go into water, and when you come out, there's a kind of rebirth or renewal. However, if you are a woman who is struggling with loss, whether it's infertility, and every month who every month is an indication that what one most wants hasn't happened, and yet here's another month, but fraught with so much anxiety and fear. Someone just wrote in the chat, of course, if someone's experienced a pregnancy loss, they may be going to the mikveh in a state of mourning a miscarriage or a loss or a silent birth. All of those can turn the mikveh into a mourning space. I once heard a Reform rabbi in England, whose name I don't remember, a lovely woman.
Miriam Berger, probably.
Maybe.
Yeah, sorry.
Who said that the mikveh, really, she said it very publicly, that years of infertility, it took her a long time to have, I think, a second child, and she felt the mikveh was a pool of tears. And I've quoted that many, many times. That really just held her. But for other women, they don't have that kind of compassionate experience. The mikveh is a reminder of loss, and going through the mikveh is a very painful process. And of course, people who are mourning other losses, whether it's a parent or a child, here's this space we pause in, and we're surrounded by water, and there's a sense of washing, of renewal, of spiritual renewal. And if you're not ready for that, it can be painful. And so many more examples.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard people talk about the mikveh connecting to the pool of tears of every woman, and every woman brings her tears, some of joy, some of sadness, for all different kinds of opportunities in life, and that is part of the cycle of life that we're in. So, but you mentioned the spiritual side, which mikveh is so ensconced with a spiritual transformation, and hopefully understanding that it's not really a physical transformation as much as a spiritual transformation. So Sally, I want to come back to you, and then Nechama, you can connect into that even more if you want to, of what the tahara around death. What does that do spiritually what does it do for the mate? How do we connect to that?
I heard a lovely phrase that the tahara process, people do it, we're sort of midwives of the soul. So those who are doing the tahara are accompanying the soul. It's obviously left the body already, but in processing the tahara process enables the soul to leave gently from the body and to be taken care of. Obviously, it's sort of a Kabbalistic notion. We don't really know. It's what those with faith believe. But there is this notion that it gives the body it releases the soul from the body, and to do that in a respectful way brings comfort. And for those families where that's important, knowing that that's the process that's gone on, I think can also be a consolation. It's certainly a very spiritual experience in the broadest sense of the word, in terms of being a member of the Chevra and in the room, in that space at the time. It's not, because it's very quiet, it's very, if you think of spirituality, the sort of reflective, meditative process, that you are there with the body, with your own thoughts, with you reflecting on, who was this person? What was her life about? Who did she matter to? And trying to evoke that. There is a very evocative atmosphere in the room, in my experience. So I'd like to think that as the soul is being accompanied, that those of us who are participating are sort of perhaps channeling our own sense of trying to make meaning with that soul. It's a very ephemeral sort of feeling. It's hard to articulate, but this notion of we're being midwives of the soul, I find very heartening in many ways. And as to Olam Haba, no one's come back to tell us. So.
Well, I'm sure, Nechama, I'm sure you also have, but my thoughts as you're speaking, Sally, is really when we go to the mikveh and the process of tahara on a regular cycle. So again, we have our physical bodies. They're the conduits of our soul, and oftentimes we don't give that soul space in our world. And when we go to the mikveh, we prepare beforehand, we cleanse our body beforehand, and then we go into the mikveh and we are going through a transformation, which really has nothing to do with our physical bodies, though our physical body is where we perform all of the mikveh rites, I guess we would call it. Like we do it with our body, but it is in order to go through a transformation that is not really physical. It allows us to move into a different state, and that's completely, and that's very much what you were describing, is this physical body which doesn't have the life elements anymore, but we still want to allow it, the soul, to go out of it, right? So it's we're really doing something that through the physical body, we're doing an act on the physical body that it connects or releases, right, the soul. There's actually a lot of parallel there in a way. Maybe I didn't articulate it well,
Yeah,
but
no, I think you're right.
So, I'm going to be wary, and I don't like to impose spirituality. I think, Judaism is very, or halachic Judaism, is very much about following a certain structure that involves kind of rules and practice, and those have to be followed regardless of whether there is a spiritual response to the practice. So I'm hesitant, as always, to impose spirituality, even though I like what you're saying, Naomi, meaning there is, I go into the mikvah and I'm tamei and I'm prohibited sexually, and then I come out of the mikvah and now I'm tahora and I'm permitted sexually. And so there is a kind of irrational transformation. And so if we want to pit spirituality across from rationality, as if, and we often do that, the spiritual is irrational or the spiritual is not connected to the cerebral, then something happens that we can't really rationally explain, right? This idea that it's just water, and it's the water I find in my bathtub and in my shower, and yet this particular space has a transformative quality to it because God said so, the Torah said so, the halacha said so. But I think, with the Chevra Kadisha as well, it's very important to follow the protocol, right? It's not like you can come in and decide, well, this isn't feeling spiritual enough. If we would pour the water this way, it would actually be more of a river. There might be more of a current and maybe more of a flow. Meaning, ultimately, we're somewhat boundary. Right? There's a boundary, many boundaries put by the way in which we do things, the structure, and there are people who will find that impedes spirituality. I'm curious to know, and I'll ask you, Sally, when I finish my little bit, if that resonates at all. But I will say, so I don't impose spirituality when I teach women or take women to the mikvah. I offer it as a way of looking for meaning, of finding meaning, that there is a space that's created in the water, either using for prayers for others, prayers for myself, or just allowing the water to be a space of mindful, kind of a mindlessness, actually releasing. But I certainly don't impose it. And I think it's important to say that not all women find the mikveh to be a spiritual experience. They do it because they have to. Not everyone finds Shabbos to be a spiritual experience. People do it because you have to do it. Ultimately, it's far more beneficial. It's more resonant. It creates more inspiration if we can find spiritual meaning. But there's this tension between obligation and spirituality. That's not a simple tension, because I'm now being forced to do this in a specific way, and it actually may be more spiritually for me to do it other ways. And we see this with prayer, certainly, the fight against using standardized prayer as a blocking towards something spiritual. And yet the counter argument would be, well, if you didn't have standardized prayer, people might not pray 3 times a day, right? So that tension. And so I like the idea that the mikveh potentially can be a space of transformation and renewal, And I'm hesitant to guarantee or offer or impose that. Some women really just want to come because they have to and not because they want to start searching for meaning. Meaning will be found elsewhere. Sally, is there anything that might resonate with what I said with your work?
Yes, I think that we sort of, spirituality, I guess it's a social construct as well. We create this term and we give it meaning to make us perhaps feel better about it or give it another layer to it. So it's almost all these rites that we go through have an anthropological element, a cultural element. It's just a matter of which framework we want to see them through. The big difference, obviously, is that with the Chevra, it's the final act. There's no second chance. You're not coming back next month. So I think there's perhaps a sort of, maybe I can only speak for the women, I can only speak for myself. At that moment, you're trying to make something of that final act with that person and that person's last moments of life or, of religious. It's the last time that person has a chance to participate in religious life, even though they are inanimate. Yet they are having something done to them that is that last act of, it's performed on them and it's their last moment to be able to engage in something physically in this world, even though they are obviously not, they're present, they're physically present, but they're not really.
So what I wanted to ask though is, we talked a bit about the soul, the releasing the soul, maybe Abba. Have you met mikveh attendants that find the gravitas, and the gravitas of the work, the silence, the peacefulness, the compassion, preparing the body for burial, but don't resonate with the idea of soul and olam haba? Because I think for myself, right, I'm not sure I connect I love hearing about the work and the tremendous dignity and respect and compassion. And there's something very beautiful about the whole process of tahara, preparing the body for burial. But does that come automatically with a connection to some of what you just, the soul and the olam haba, or not, everyone has?
Yeah, I can't say I have it all the time, so probably,
Right.
and there are probably some of people, I don't think there's one formula, obviously, and it's not something one talks about a lot. And even in the room, there's we sort of have a team leader, there's 4 of us and one person's in charge. There's one woman in particular who is so, I must say, really inspiring in terms of her. When I'm doing it with her, I really feel she has such kavod, such honor for the body. It really inspires all of us. And I feel like she's really tapped into that. And others, it'll just depend. And you can't always tell. Somebody can be very pragmatic and very pass with the scissors, pass, if you need to cut a bandage. And it's a very almost mechanical act. But you really don't know what's going on inside somebody, obviously. So I don't think there's one formula. But I suppose if you're attracted to doing this, you've got an element of the ephemeral, an element of trying to, maybe it's a life stage, trying to find a engagement with Judaism that is not, that has something, I don't know, extra to it, or something that's not about making challah or about an extra humrah somewhere, that there's something a bit more life affirming in many ways. I mean, I do find the process actually very life affirming, ironically and paradoxically. I can't explain why, but I do. But this, perhaps, Naomi, we should chat about this secrecy and what's taboo.
That would be great. I want to say that again, my association, when you're talking about how the Chevra Kadisha works, and they stand, and each person is very much by themselves in the room with each other, and there's not a lot of talking that goes on. And there's not, and you don't go out and then talk to each other about who
definitely,
is this. Yeah. For me, as somebody who works in the realm of mikveh, it very much resonates with the fact that, and things are changing, but traditionally, mikveh attendants are very careful to protect the privacy of all the women who are there. And they don't.
Can I interrupt you, Naomi, and tell you a funny story? It's from the Middle Ages, and I forget what shoot it's in, but there was a town where the practice was the balanit was the rabbi's wife, when she would actually tell the rabbi who had gone to the mikveh, and in the morning he would go and shake the hand of the man, Yasher Koach, or whatever you say. And someone new came to the town and was horrified by this practice. And so he managed to put a stop. I think it was a new rabbi, privacy and so on. And almost immediately there was a drop in attendance. And it was very, very interesting, right? This idea that I'm accountable. So I'm accountable, and the rabbi's wife knows, and the rabbi knows. And we've become a little puritanical about protecting the privacy. But as Rav Moshe writes in one of his tshuvas, women wore different clothing when they were nida, and then they changed when they weren't. So everyone kind of knew when you went to the mikvah. And so I'm not coming out against privacy. That's where we are right now. But I'm just bringing anecdotes to show that is the word is modern, that evolved with this need for extreme privacy around sexuality and certainly around death. And I wonder if the Chevra Kadisha was always so private and taboo. I think it's become a little too taboo because no one knows what goes on. I mean, the first time I heard about it was at a limud, and this wonderful woman from America on the Chevra Kadisha spoke about it, and I was so moved and really wanted to learn more. And so secrecy sometimes prevents us from really understanding some of the most beautiful rituals we have.
Absolutely. When anybody on this call, when you next come to London, there's a museum called the Vagina Museum, and it's fascinating. And just you talked about clothing. I'll come back to the secrecy. There was women used to wear red clothes when they had their period, so that if there was any leakages, whatever, it wouldn't show up in their. And they have this whole exhibition around women wearing red clothing before before pads and tampons. It's a fascinating museum, actually. And you walk around there, you're a bit like, where do I look next? Where do I look next? But the secrecy, when I joined the Chevra in London, it was very much, you mustn't tell anybody, it's secret, all this, it's taboo to talk about it, And I thought, that appealed to me because I thought I wasn't looking to show off. I thought this is terrific. This is very tsanua, very modest. It's not about your ego. Just do it and be kind and do the work. And I then had a Shabbat meal with friends, and an American was visiting. And out of the blue, she just started talking about her work on the Chevra Kadisha. And I was like really taken aback a bit. And I said, a friend of mine who's on the Chevra Kadisha, she told me that apparently you're not meant to talk about it. And this woman said, that's rubbish. And I thought, this is like a cultural clash, the Americans, the British. She said, that's rubbish. How are people meant to know about it if you don't talk about it? Death is a part of life. You have to recruit, and just very sensible arguments. And I thought, oh, that's very sensible. She's right. And then I sort of started, I was just so indoctrinated in not talking about it. And then I started thinking about it some more, thinking, she's really right. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. And then what I really wanted to do was write a book interviewing the women on the Chevra, sort of a sociological, why did they do it, their motivation, some of their experiences. And I called up the woman who runs the Chevra, and I said, because I needed her permission to contact everyone. And I said, I wanted to do this. She said, under no circumstances, that's outrageous. How could you even think of an idea? I really felt I was in big trouble. We can't do that. It has to be quiet. And so I thought, okay, that's not going to go anywhere. So I decided to write my own thing anyway. But I've done it first of all, it's not just about the Chevra, it's a whole lot of other things. But I've done it, I think, in an appropriate way. But it really struck me how. And then I've had a lot of people say to me, you're right, we have to break this taboo. As long as I would never talk about anybody that one has done any specifics, but it is a part of life. And as we know, and I don't know where everybody's coming from on this call, there are communities where people are less engaged with Jewish life. They don't really know very much, and they'll be less engaged with Jewish death, quite frankly. And unless people understand Jewish traditions around death, it doesn't give them an option. They won't know. I mean, I think there are many beautiful things about the Chevra and the process. And if you choose not to engage with it or don't know even to ask about it, then people will choose to bury their dead in very different ways or choose not to bury them in a Jewish way at all. And if you care about that, then you will care about the Chevra Kadisha as well. But the taboo-ness, and interestingly, actually, I should say, at this Shabbos table that I mentioned, there was a man at the English man at the table, and he said, "I'm on our Chevra at the shul. They never told the men to be quiet. I've never heard such a thing. How ridiculous!" And then I started thinking, is this a conspiracy to keep women quiet? Sort of the women should be, it's okay for the men to talk about it, maybe the women. And then I thought maybe I'm getting a little paranoid. I don't know. But it was that was actually interesting, because he said, "That's ridiculous. I'm on our Chevra. We talk about it not all the time, but we were never told not to say anything." So I did wonder if there's a difference between the men and the women. And
I find this very interesting, because I find it in so many ways parallel to the whole discussion around mikveh and taharat hamishpacha. And where so many women have been taught, you don't talk about the time that you go, you don't ask anybody, you don't share, we don't talk about these things, we don't discuss these things. And in my conclusion, and part of what Eden does, is we say, you have to talk about these things. If you want people to experience, if you want people to feel like they own it, they have to be able to express, this is difficult for me. This is, what do you do? Speak with other people. But more than that, if we want our children to do it, why would anybody who doesn't know something today, everything is out in the world, everything is open, and this is the only thing we don't talk about. We have to talk about. Judaism is a sex positive religion. Now mikveh is so associated with sex. We have to allow that to be known. We have to let people know that we have a framework around, but also that mikveh is part of Jewish life. And I actually think that it's interesting in the non-Orthodox world that people have begun to embrace the spiritual side of mikveh much more, but they have come back to it, but it wasn't something talked about. And I think in our community, it's so crucial to talk about it and do away with that taboo, exactly for the reasons that you're talking about, in parallel with the need for publishing a book that a little bit discusses what the Chevra Kadisha does, so that all of us can appreciate. We all know, and we all say it's chesed shel emet, but we still didn't know what it is until you came and wrote about it. Go ahead.
And the need for secrecy, like what you're describing around mikveh, can be very harmful, because there was always a community of women who knew or were allowed to know. And so women who have to go Friday night, suddenly the idea of telling a friend, "Can you watch my children?" or a mother, a family member, becomes so tense and difficult and embarrassing. And some women will even want to push off the mikveh till Saturday night, so they don't have to get anyone to help them. And again, obviously everyone needs to make the call they're making. But I think sometimes there's an overemphasis on again, it becomes a secret rather than private. Yes, it's private, but we share private information with people that we trust. And the idea that, it's embarrassing for me to let someone know that I'm going to the mikveh, I think can sometimes be harmful. There are ways of doing it in a more healthy way. Again, I'm going to quote my cousin Jody Waxpress, who's a sex therapist and a therapist, and this idea of privacy versus secrecy, I think, is really important, right? That the Chevra Kadisha is private, who is being cared for, how, we don't talk about specifics, but it's not a secret, and it shouldn't be a secret. And I think if that's part of what you did with your book, and that's what that man in your community said, wait, we talk about it. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
There's
privacy. I think that's a really good differentiation between privacy and secret. I think that's really helpful, actually.
Well, part of the conversation, as I've seen it, is that the secrecy per se is about modesty and protecting people's modesty. And perhaps there's an over protection. So I would actually like to go into the how do you protect the modesty of the people that both in the Chevra Kadisha and as a balanit, and in the realm of mikveh? I'm asking both of you, so you can both.
Well, on a very practical level, in the Tahara room, as I said in the introduction, the body is covered, and the bits that we wash, we just uncover. So 3 people will hold the sheet, and the 4th person will have the sort of shower tap or buckets of water, depending on what sort of setup you've got, and we'll wash that part of the body. There's one moment when the whole body is washed at the same time, and 3 of the women will hold up a big sheet, and the person washing the body will spray the water on the person. But in my experience, when I've done it, I don't like sort of stare at the body. You're just, you've got the shower head and you're washing the body. So there is a very strong sense of preserving the woman's dignity and modesty in the room, very strong. And then the modesty of we've just talked about privacy, secrecy. We try to maintain that outside the room. I think it's more of a challenge perhaps in the mikveh, where the woman might feel embarrassed about her body or have challenges, and the balanit has to really deal with that. But Nechama would be best.
Yeah, so I think back to part of what I try to do, work in the mikveh.
Your microphone's a little funny.
So I said that part of, is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Part of what I think can be done is working with the woman so that she feels comfortable with the way that she's immersing. Traditionally the mikveh attendant kind of turns around or turns to the side while the woman comes in and takes off her towel. For some women, that's still too much exposure. So certainly women can ask that the attendant only come in once they're in the water and leave before they go out of the water. Mm-hmm. So again, part of that is going to be very much individual. Some women have no problem taking off their towel or robe with the mikveh attendant in the similar way that sometimes in the locker room, some women are more or less comfortable exposing themselves even within a space that's only women. Some women just going into the water and having the attendant come in just for the immersion, that also really protects their privacy, their modesty, their self-consciousness. And then the mikveh attendant leaves and they can come out and wrap themselves and go into their room. That's certainly another model that we offer. And the third, and it's one that's more perhaps popular in Israel, but is allowing the woman, if she asks or if she chooses, to go in by herself without an attendant. There are some halachic guidelines she would need, but certainly for women who are particularly self-conscious of their body, or again, sometimes it's not only self-consciousness, it's this inner modesty, this sense of, I need to do this alone. This is mine, and I can't have having everyone in there. So that allows them that space. It is exceptional, except in Israel, it is something that went to the courts, and a woman is allowed to ask for it. In our mikveh, we actually even will offer a woman, or we've educated the women in our community to know they can ask for it. And I feel for some women who have body issues or are uncomfortable with anyone in that space, it can be really, really empowering to be able to take back that space. And I'll just, I'll throw out some of the exceptional situations. A woman who, God forbid, has been through any sort of sexual trauma, a woman who has had any sort of surgery, mastectomies, or have had disfiguring surgeries, knowing that no one is going to be in there. If someone has a false eye or a prosthesis of any sort, some women want women with them and some women don't. And I think really respecting the right of the woman to feel empowered to choose what will make this the most comfortable, the most spiritual, the most meaningful, the least fraught with tension and anxiety. And really that's about protecting. What I've just described is any of those options reflect a certain modesty. It's just a matter. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking about that as you were talking, that we see women obviously that have had mastectomies or other body, issues. And I've often thought she wouldn't want us to see her like this. And, or would she want us, how would she? I was just thinking about it, just as you were about to say it, I thought there is something very dignified in covering up the body even when she's dead, just from that point of view, because we don't know how comfortable or uncomfortable she may have felt with the changes that her body experienced. And also, quite frankly, women who are very large, or perhaps very emaciated from ill health, or perhaps from anorexia, but women who are very large are often very self-conscious about how they look naked. Similarly, when you're at the end, when you're lying there having a tahara on you, and you don't know what's happening to you. But if you imagine how the woman might have felt, knowing that her body was going to be on full show, it's actually very dignified to keep her covered, that keeping her modesty even when she doesn't know about it. just thinking about it while you were talking.
And I just want to reinforce, in most of the world, mikveh attendants, regardless of what the mikveh policy is, work very hard to ensure the modesty and privacy of the women. Even without going to what a woman could ask for. The idea of, again, turning aside, holding up the towel for the woman. There are all sorts of kind of little things mikveh attendants do to try to help the woman feel protected and safe and cared for.
And I think that part of that also is the idea that we don't talk about it outside, and I'm not going to go and tell somebody that I saw you eat, because even though there is the idea of creating a woman community, I'm not going to go around announcing that you came to the mikveh. Just like a Chevra Kadisha is not going to walk around and say, do you know what I saw? Or, that this person.
Yes, no, totally. They're not going to do. But sometimes I've been in the kosher supermarket or at shul. There's been a bar mitzvah and somebody, has come to visit the community, and somebody will come up to me and give me a bit of a wink and hi, how are you? I'm thinking, who is this woman? And then I realize it's somebody that I've done a tahara with, because out of context, because I don't socialize with the women. You're just sort of 4 women who turn up on the day or on your rota day, and hello, morning, and then you leave. And then when you see them in a social context, it's like, where do I know you from? And it's actually quite reassuring that you can't quite place them. But then when you do place them, there's almost like this sort of special bond. And maybe the mikveh, the balanit, and the woman who she has supervised in the mikveh also feels a special bond if they see each other outside, or they want to run away from each other. I don't know. But
I have to tell you, Nechama, you can address this also, but I have met so many mikveh attendants that sort of like, you see people in one context, you erase it, and you're not seeing them in the same way, and you're not associating between when they were doing a mitzvah in this modest and protective environment and seeing them in the supermarket the next day. And oftentimes you won't acknowledge. And it's interesting because women are often like so self-conscious of, I saw you, or what can I say something to the mikveh attendant? And mikveh attendants are just, regular women in the community. You can say hi, whatever.
I think that, we have to remember that just in the way doctors are taught to value patient confidentiality and therapists, it's part of a professional core of people that just are educated with the job to respect the privacy and the confidentiality that comes with the job. And so I think that that's kind of ingrained or inborn. Like even when you're talking about who I saw in the mikveh, like who would do that, right? You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't talk about the women who were there or what you saw. It just wouldn't happen.
I don't think that there's a parallel, but it made me think about sometimes you've done a tahara on somebody, and the family will have great comfort knowing that, say if you were a friend of the person or a relative, and you were able to go to the shiva and say to them quietly, I did the tahara for your mother, your daughter, sister, whatever it is. And some people find great comfort in knowing that. Some people don't want, it'll obviously be different for everybody. I can't imagine there's a parallel for mikveh attendants, unless you can think of one. But it's sort of somehow giving comfort to the bereaved, to let them know that somebody that they knew cared for their deceased, can be a very, somehow you feel they've been looked after well. It can be helpful. Sometimes it's not appropriate to tell people. Obviously, it depends.
So I guess the parallel would be every so often I've taught a bride and taken her to the mother will call and say, "Thank you for doing that."
Right.
So glad.
Your microphone isn't working so well.
Oh, so I said, I don't know if you heard that last bit, but I said that sometimes a mother will call me after I've taught her daughter and taken her to the mikveh and thanked me
Nice.
and said, look, it's you were the right person. I didn't know how the experience was going to be for her, and you made it so positive. And so I assume that's not unique, and there are other college teachers or mikveh attendants who have been thanked for their sensitivity in a situation, and so on. So yes, it can be very meaningful, especially for a family member who knows a particular woman might struggle with mikvah, to know that it was a safe space for them.
That's nice.
I think we could continue for a long time, but I just want to invite anybody who is in the audience, if anybody has questions, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself. And we have a lot more things I think we could talk about here, but I do want to invite, if anybody does want to ask a question, to either write it to me in the chat or to sort of indicate that you.
Sure. I'm just looking. Rifki says, in our community, we don't tell the family. We don't usually also tell, but sometimes you may happen. Yeah, we also don't usually tell. It's more sometimes you may know the family member, and so it's you'll be able to gauge whether it's appropriate to tell them or not. So somebody here from Stockholm and Helsinki, who I'm sure everybody who's involved in the Chevra, there are different little customs. I don't know if they want to write about them or share them, or maybe different mikveh customs. Also interesting to hear.
There are many more. I'm happy in the meantime, if nobody has a specific question that they want to ask right now, and feel free to continue writing on the chat. I'm just thinking of some other interesting parallels of, what do you think about that? Do people fear coming to, is there fear around it? Is there fear of being known? Is there fear? Like, what are the fears? Because you did bring that up.
From Nechama or myself? Sorry.
Either of you.
Fear, I'm not sure of the question.
Yeah.
Just of finding out information about what?
I'm saying, do you think that one of the things that I think is parallel, there are a lot of parallels. This one has water of mikvah. This is done in the water. This one, there's a whole list. We protect the modesty in this way. Kavod briot is so interesting.
Yeah. Clean the nails. Clean the nails.
Yes.
Yeah. When you mentioned the nails, I had an interesting conversation with Sally that, especially since there are so many people here who are mikvah attendants or were clearly on a Chevra Kadisha. It's one of the conversations that I have seen coming up among mikvah attendants all over recently is the question of gel nail polish and whether it serves as a chatzitza. And so, Sally, I asked you, what do people have to remove before? What does the Chevra Kadisha remove before you can be buried? Is gel nail polish a problem?
Remove any sort of bandages and anything that can be taken off. Sometimes you need to leave a bandage or a tube. You have to leave it there because to take it out would create sort of havoc on the body. But nails, if we don't saw them off, we don't pull them off if they're the gel nails, we just leave them there. Nail polish that's on, we remove with acetone, nail polish, toe polish, but actual gel nails, there's not much you can do with it. There may be other chevras that have a different solution, but from what my experience is, you just leave it. Not much you can do.
That's fascinating. Someone just asked, does the final tahara have a blessing? That's an interesting question.
There is. So at the end of the tahara, the body's placed in the coffin, and then we say a tefillah, really asking for mechila. Asking for forgiveness if we've hurt the person in any way during the tahara process, if we've made a mistake. So it's really very again, I agree with you, Nechama, about the use of the word spiritual, and it's a little bit of a tricky, awkward word, but there is something very powerful in asking this person for forgiveness, and you're really making yourself. I was going to say humbling, in a way, not humiliating, it's not humiliating, but you really have to sort of say, I could have made a mistake. Even on the dead person, I could have made a mistake. And I think that's a very powerful thing. There are different chevras that I've heard of, but when they put each part of the body, they say a different pasuk with, and they're saying or they're saying Tehillim during the tahara process. That's not been my experience. There's a couple
Rena
of
just wrote on the chat that we have a series of tefillot that we're said at different stages of the tahara.
Right. So there is something, a pasuk, a few words you say when you put on the bonnet, and also when you place them into the coffin, just 3 or 4 words from different pasukim in the Tanakh. But otherwise, yes, I'd be interesting to know what Rena's, where she's from and what they do. So that was the answer to the question about saying a final blessing. So it's yeah. And you also say a blessing before you start. That I can't remember that. It's a bit of a paragraph, that you be endowed with the right the word isn't mindfulness, but the right sort of frame of mind to sort of undergo this task, and with the right intentions, and that you're put in the right frame of mind before you're about to do it. But again, that may vary from chevra to chevra. I just don't know. Somebody's saying they also don't minhag hamakom. Somebody's saying Rifki saying that a lot of it, yes, based on minhag hamakom. And
Definitely.
we use white tachrichim, but I have heard in some places there's coloured tachrichim, or with decorative, which is quite unusual. The whole idea of tachrichim was many years ago, thousands of years ago, that people were leaving their dead on the streets because they couldn't afford to dress them up to get buried. And so there was a takana ruling that everybody should be dressed simply in the same thing, so that it was, rich, poor, doesn't matter. You all get buried in the same clothing. It's a complete antithesis of sort of funerals where you're dressed in your Sunday best and embalmed, and it's a complete antithesis to that.
And actually, the takana came from Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabban Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel, who was a very wealthy person, and a very elite, wealthy man. The Gamliels were a very wealthy family, and recognized that it was too big a burden on. And so for someone wealthy to say, look, we're all going to be buried the same way, was a very big social justice move, like this idea of evening the experience so everyone could afford burial. And that's what we do to this day.
Yeah. Somebody saying
I think
here,
an interesting question that was asked was, is there a problem with a woman who's a Kohanit being on the Chevra Kadisha? I suppose a bat Kohen or a wife of a Kohen.
It's funny. So I actually thought about that this morning, actually, in preparation for tonight. And I don't know the answer. I don't know if anybody in the group, I can't imagine it does, because you're not stopped from, although you don't have a pidyon ben if you're a bat Kohen. I don't know the answer. Somebody saying the tafrichim in Gothenburg have a little lace on the collars. Yes, we also have somebody saying I'm a bat Kohen on the chevra. Yeah. Is there anything around mikveh ladies about that?
There is on the Chevra Kadisha. Yeah. Beautiful. So you see, in this group, there are so many connections and answers from practice. I do think it's beautiful, as we're reading down in the comments, that there are so many people who are involved, and so many people who are actually involved with both mitzvot.
Carla's raised her hand, Naomi.
Yeah.
Vakasha, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, I am unmuted, but I still put my hands up. No, I was wondering, because I'm originally from the Netherlands, and my mother was niftar about 3.5 years ago. So they asked me whether I wanted to do something, whether I wanted to put a sock on, or so I thought that was very special to do for my mom. I mean, somebody who can't do anything back, that's what they always say. But is that only in the Netherlands, or have you ever come across that, Sally? Or in England? I mean, I lived in London for 30+ years.
Right. I have heard of that, but you sort of need to be quite well informed. I think so families are asked if they want to see the body after it's been prepared before they put the lid on the coffin. From what I've heard, most families say no, that they're not ready, because you're doing it within 24 hours. It's still such a shock. Perhaps if it's a very old person and they knew it was coming, it might be a bit different. But people are in a bit of state of, they're all over the place. I have heard that sometimes people are offered, but I don't know who's offered. I don't know that it's standard to be offered it. It's a lovely idea.
I thought it was just very special. And also they asked me whether I wanted to put the sand, the earth from
right
here. and also whether I wanted to say something still, which I found a bit, how can I say, a bit creepy, a bit like, yeah, but the person doesn't hear, but still to say it. And my brother was there as well, and he's not really involved, but in Judaism, but he did a lot for my mom, and he also said something which was very moving.
I think life cycle moments are the points at which people reflect on what is their relationship to Judaism. And, when your kid is having if you've got a brit or some ceremony for the girl, bar mitzvahs, parents think, what do I want for my child, bar mitzvah. But death is sort of the last chance you've got, in a way, for that person. And I think a lot of people take on Kaddish, men, women who may not have been particularly observant during their own life, but when particularly if they know that would be important for their parent, death is almost an entry point for some people. For some people, it's an exit point as well, depending how they're treated. And we know for many women who want to say Kaddish, there's been a lot written about that. Things have definitely changed in the last 20 years, but certainly before then, it's often been the point when women have left certainly Orthodox practice because they've not been encouraged or welcomed to say Kaddish. But for many women, it can be a re-entry point, actually, if they've been a little bit alienated now. I've seen that, but not just for anybody, men and women. Death can be that moment when they think, well, maybe Judaism does have something to offer me. Because there is that structure of the Shiva, the Shloshim, the Yatzat, the Yis, the moment of Yizkor, when every year you're reminded, there's formal recognition in the synagogue. So I think your brother, perhaps not having been engaged before, that became a moment for him to reconsider his relationship with Judaism. And I don't know if there's a parallel every month or not, but maybe when there's a baby born or coming to terms with infertility is also a moment when you have to reconsider, where's my place in Jewish life? So
I think for many people that potential point, especially in Chutz La'aretz, is when you're getting married, and you oftentimes it's a rite of passage.
Yes,
and we're now doing a mikveh attendant course in Australia, and they talked about even people who are marrying non-Jews wanting to come to the mikveh potentially, and at least it being a connection or transition. But there are so many more things that we could talk about, and we could probably go on and on. But I really want to thank you. This has been fascinating. And I want to recommend again that people access and read Sally's book. You can buy it on her website.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And you can buy it on Amazon in the UK. And I want to also say that in the lead up to Tisha B'Av, I think it was very worthwhile having this discussion about Tahara and understanding from so many different places how we get and connect to it. Thank you, everybody who participated and asked questions. Nechama, Sally.
I'll add one thing, something interesting that's happened in Israel. Women are going up to Har HaBayit on the Temple Mount on Tisha B'Av and are going to the mikveh on Tisha B'Av, which is like, right, wow. Because they have to go for Tahara, not for the sexual permissibility. And there you have the coming together of the morning over the temple, and yet this transition towards Tahara. It's very, very interesting nexus of a lot of different things. So ending with Tisha B'Av as we head towards that day.
Fascinating.
Anyway.
Okay, we should all meet next week for happy occasions.
I have a question. Is it possible for us to share this link to the discussion? I would really very much like to share it with my head of the Chevra Kadisha in Stockholm.
Yeah, so we'll send a link. We'll get it up on our website, and we'll send a link, please God, tomorrow, and we'll send the link to Sally's book as well. And Bezrat Hashem, Nechama, when you have a book, we will do a launch, and we will have.
We'll come back version 2.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody from all over.
Laila Tov.
Thanks a lot.